Sure.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our session today on the power of legislation transforming open education in the U.S. state of Colorado. Today, we are going to be discussing how we use legislation and people, importantly, to transform open ed in our state of Colorado.
Here is our state of Colorado. It's the little pink square there. I want to make some terminology clear. When we use the word state, we're referring to the pink square where we live and where this legislation is applicable to. If we want to speak about the whole big green country, then we'll use the term federal. Will be helpful as we move forward to avoid confusion. I put some statistics up here. I'm not sure if you can read them from where you're seated, but just for context's sake, the population of Colorado is similar to that of Scotland. And then the physical footprint of Colorado is similar to that of the whole of the UK. I also have listed there the number of unis and colleges that we have, as well as students, higher education students. And those are some of our mountains. We're located in a flat area. That's where the state capital is. So both Chealsye and I are in and around that.
And just to introduce yourself, to give you a little bit of context about who we are and why we're talking about this. I'm Chealsye Bowley, the Director of Open Education and Learning Innovation for the Colorado Department of Higher Ed. In my role, I manage our state's grant program, which we'll tell you more about. I coordinate the OER Council and a statewide OER conference. My position is through a piece of state government. My boss's boss is appointed by the governor, similar to a first minister. And I came through this role not being a legislative worker, but actually being a librarian, like the majority of attendees here. For years, I was a scholarly communication librarian, where I got to work on OA, OER, and open data initiatives at a few colleges. I managed open publishing, proper, and IR services. So that was the background that I came to. I don't get to work with faculty one-on-one anymore unless maybe they're the PI for grants. So I do miss that kind of work, but I get to help liaise and work with a lot of my former counterparts at their respective institutions and get to work across the whole state, primarily at public institutions of higher education. We'll kind of talk a little bit about that distinction.
Right, and I'm Jaimie Henthorn, and I work for the University of Colorado. And our connection and crossover is, of course, with, we use the term OER rather than OE, so you'll hear us say that more. So with OER, with Chealsye at the state level, where I am one of the council members of our statewide council, I'm the chair currently this year. My role at the university is the director for academic innovation programs. And I wear quite a few hats in that role, one of them being the OER hat, so I'll just put that one on for today and just wear that one. But I work with all four of our institutions. And so I manage the OpenCU initiative as well, where we've managed to have all four campuses. It's a bit of a unicorn. We have all four campuses working together, closely together, and more or less mirroring how they manage their the use of the state funding. So we apply for the state funding together and we use the state funding in similar ways that are measured in similar ways across the campuses. So we'll be speaking about the legislation at the state level today, but if anybody is interested in talking about sort of university organization, then OER, I'm also available for that.
All right, so just some highlights. We are now in our 5th year of the grant program, but we've only had 3 reporting cycles. So we'll use both 3 years and 5 years when we're talking about this. But over the first 3 years of our grant funding, students have saved an estimated $20.5 million from an investment of $2.4 million from the state. This is a return on investment for over 8 times. Cost savings is not the most important part. I think we all can agree with that as far as open education practitioners. But for lawmakers, our administrators of institutions, that ROI is a really huge reason why the work continues to be supported. And I feel like public funding, state dollars are getting really stressed far with that 8 times return. I'm expecting, don't quote me yet, even though technically this is being recorded, I do think we're going to get really close to 50 million after our next reporting cycle. Again, this is also assuming that the OER is being reused each year. We have addressed nearly 1,000 courses over those first 3 years. Last year, in the cohort 3 reporting cycle is where this graphic is from, 64,000 students were enrolled in courses with OER. Some of them probably were enrolled in more than one, but generally that is 29% of the entire higher education student body in Colorado, which is a really good chunk for a third-year win. The first 3 years, the grants were 500,000, 1 million, and then 1 million in the first 3 years being awarded, which is a significant amount, very thankful for it, and then we'll kind of talk about how we got that money. But how we've transformed Open Ed in Colorado is the backbone of everything is the OER Council, the group that Jaimie is the chair of. They guide Open Ed work. There's a full-time coordinator at the Department of Higher Ed, my job, that's funded through legislation. We get to award that $1 million in OER grants annually. That's a huge impact. I do think though, one can make significant drives and impact if you're awarded 50,000 or 5 million. Like you can really scale this depending on one's context. And then we host an annual statewide OER conference. Last year's conference, between virtual and in-person attendance, had about 300 open access or open ed practitioners, faculty, librarians, instructional designers, some students attend. And it's really through like those 4 streams, I think we get our biggest impact and transformation. And all this came from legislation, right? The OER Council is actually not a group of people that just came together. It is designed and identified through a piece of legislation. It's identified, and I'll dig a little bit more into the specifics of that, but the legislation outlines who like minimum requirements of representational maps. That's important too. It's not just me getting to decide like these are my favorite 12 people in the state. That there's quotas we need to meet and representation, try to making it fair. Although no one can be, all institutions cannot be represented because we do have more than 12. My job funded through legislation. The $1 million is funded through legislation, which is also great to know. We have the timeline we have to guarantee that for statewide conference funded through legislation. And your region can replicate this in the context that works for you. Maybe it would be through your own government. Maybe it would be through your administration. It could be a group of universities, whether this is your individual institution, your region, your country. There are ways you can replicate this, and it may not be the way that Colorado did it. And I think it's very important that we're gonna discover we're actually not that special. I wish we were. It'd be really lovely to say we were these magical creatures, but it came down to people, and every single person in this room is a great person.
So the legislation, is it specific for the state of Colorado or is it the federal legislation?
Colorado legislation, our state law. So we're not talking about anything at the federal level. We are talking about our state and what guides our laws.
So I want to find out what some of you wrote on your week cards. So I would really like for our voices all to be heard, not just the 2 of ours, and find out what you to hear from each other, why you came. So let's start with that. We can we're gonna go around the tables. If you want to just say pass, or you don't have to speak, so you can just like shake your head if you don't want to go. But if you would please read the reason why, or what you hope to gain from the session, and how it can contribute to an important aspect of your work. Tanya?
So me, I think it's just some insight into the role of policy and
Insight into the role. Great.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the tactics to approach government. I know it's different from my context, but for me,
Yes.
as anywhere else, has been really difficult.
Approaching government.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so to get them involved in this mindset, make change.
Great.
Is it how systems can support the local use of OER?
Systems can support the local use of OER. All right, thank you.
So I'm really just kind of interested in everything that's involved with going out and applying for funding, and understanding how that breaks down a little bit. Just being from Reclaim, we don't usually see that side of things. So that's why I'm here.
Great.
What is going on in Colorado and how can we do it in Virginia?
There you go.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in the state movements for open education and how they come to be and coalesce, like with conferences and all this stuff. So yeah, I guess it's a state movement in Colorado.
And yeah, it is a state, yeah.
Fascinated by that.
Great.
To discover how much top-down support is required and what we should be helping.
Right, okay.
Mine is very different, just learning about OER in other contexts rather than or the low resource context, it's just a new context.
Yes, okay, great, a new context.
I was interested in more about how to identify and refine an OER champion among legislators.
Identifying OER champions, yes, great. And if things we don't touch on, asking so that we can make sure to touch on things afterwards and gather these questions, so yes.
I'm also more interested from
You got a viewpoint on something, okay, great.
Yeah, I'm as well. We're from the Netherlands actually.
Great, yeah.
Our government, plays a role. We have a couple of fundings, etc.
Right.
But there's quite a distance actually between what's going on in the institutions and what the government, I think, is doing. Yeah.
Interesting, okay,
Yeah.
good to hear, thank you.
Yeah, just from the title, I think I'm interested in how funding is sort of maybe bridging the gap between policy and practice, because I think in education, there's often a big gap between, what the legislators say and what happens in the classroom, and it sort of seemed to be a hint here that maybe with this funding that maybe policy and practice are a little less disconnected than we're typically used to.
I think that's good, and you picked up on.
Well, I live in Northern Ireland, so there is no actual sitting government, so it's maybe a bit of a tricky one, but I guess what I wrote is to understand how to affect meaningful change in organizations that are resistant to change.
Resistance, yeah.
Mine's closely related to because it's what drives change, management or legislation, or is it bottom up, and how can we embed it in the organization? Which is the way to embed it?
Right, which direction is it coming from?
Yeah.
How do we embed it? Yeah, great.
Yeah. So I'm from the Republic of Ireland,
Yeah.
and I want to actually have the policy insight on how things function back in Ireland. I think I would have some takeaways from here, which I want to see and compare to how things are done in Ireland, and also apply to a very different context.
Right, yeah, very
That's what
good.
I'm looking for.
Great, yes?
I'm just curious about the different outcomes between top-down versus bottom-up drivers. I'm much more familiar with bottom-up drivers, so
Right.
this is novel.
Right, right.
I'm looking for the end feeling and purpose of open education, just the search for arguments how to stimulate it
Yes.
within an organization or traditionally or,
Great, thank you. Right, Chealsye.
Oh. How does it-
To the right. She's working.
Okay. All right, so let's dive into legislation and really what that background was in Colorado and how that changed. In 2017, our Senate bill was drafted that formed our OER Council, and alongside it funded $20,000 to commission a report about what opication was, what would be the most impactful way for Colorado to adopt it, and that helped set the stage for our future bids. So really just began with a simple bill that formed the OER Council, defined open ed, which we're going to get to, and what that means for our state, and then outlined that OER Council. 2018, after that report had been commissioned, there's recommendations. Somebody was hired to draft and research that report. Who's Tanya is a name in the open ed US world. House Bill 18 established the OER grant program. So this was a second piece of legislation that expanded the OER Council, went from 10 to 12 members, and then established $500,000 in the first year of funding, and then $1 million, and then $1 million. This was set to expire in 2021. That spring, another bill was proposed, and this was really unsure what the future would be. I can't take credit for any of this, for the record. I joined late in 2021. My predecessor was a part of things. A lot of the founding OER Council members are the ones who did this work.
I've done a lot of back interviews, so if we don't answer your questions during this session, come find me, because I did quite a few interviews to prepare for this. Yes, and I was around since 2018.
And so the Senate Bill 21 expanded the grant program for another 5 years, allocating $5 million more, $1 million a year. This is set to expire November 1st of 2026. That's also when I lose my job, unless we expand further out. But that's been a huge influx of funding. The amount of work that Colorado has done because of the funding is pretty critical. Yes.
What drove the 2017 bill? What was the need?
We are going to get to that.
Okay.
But yeah, that is a great question. Something I want to highlight, and what's really important too, even if you're not getting funding yet, the fact that we have codified into law what OER means in our state is a big deal. If this is your first win as part of legislation, I personally think that's enough of a win. I mean, that's probably going to get tagged onto its, like, not in its own reason unless there's funding attached, but the fact that in 2017, we identified what OER was for our state.
Thanks.
And this specifically says release under an intellectual property license that permits free use or repurposing. So this matters. Now there is this nice little line here that says, it may include other resources that are legally available to students for free or very low cost. I read that as, well, that's not OER. Very helpfully, I know you're joining the department, the 2021 bill has already been passed, they cut that out. Literally, like, if you read the piece of legislation, it is cut, because that's not OER, it's low cost. In our state, we do define $20 or under as low cost, which also makes sense, right? When we have definitions, it helps. It helps us communicate to administrators and lawmakers and faculty what the boundaries are. We need to define our terms. This is the win in and of itself. The funding does absolutely matter, and we're very thankful for it. But so the 2021 bill, which was signed, Jaimie was there.
On your left.
So that renewed the OER grant program for those 5 years and allocated that further $1 million. That's a really important piece. It allowed us to continue this work, allowed us to continue being able to support, continue that statewide conference. Through this, we also fund other professional development. I was able to award scholarships to the Creative Commons training, and we do Open Education Network trainings, which is a really important organization within, like, the US to Canada area. But again, this is expiring in 2026. If this is all the funding we ever get, we are luckier than most places, and we know that. But we're looking forward to what happens in 2026. Do we still continue a position? Do we put another piece of legislation forward? How would this operate? With the OER Council, this is created through that legislation, as I said. Jaimie's the chair. There's 5 faculty, 3 librarians, 1 instructional designer, 1 administrator, 1 IT professional, 1 student. This is outlined in law. I can't add more. Like, there's so many librarians I would love to bring onto the council. And we have 2, like, non-voting reps from private institutions. That is my alarm. 3 designees from state government, that's myself, from the Department of Education and the State Library. It is required in law that we have a variety of representation of institution types. For example, in the states, we refer to them as community colleges. Those are often 2-year programs. There has to be at least 3 reps on the council. Stuff like that, like, we have to hit minimum of quotas, which is important, that they educate the majority of our students. The critical roles that made this happen was a legislative worker who knew the bill process and knowledgeable open education advocates. Someone mentioned how to identify that person. I think it's important that if we look back to 2017, what drove that weirdly wasn't an open ed advocate. A legislative worker who worked for the Joint Budget Committee, who's in charge of educational bills, heard about open ed, was like, oh, that could save money, and, like, reached out to the Department of Higher Ed, because that's the liaison, and then they helped identify and did a call out. That's weird. That is unlikely to occur. That is a strange convergence. But what is important is every piece of government likely would see value in a return on investment in saving students money, right? You could reach out and identify who that appropriate person is and try to make a case to them. I think we make a mistake as open ed advocates to talk about the importance of education for the greater good, because that's not always going to work for the people we're advocating to. That's I believe in open for the sake of openness, but to a lawmaker, what changes their mind is probably ROI most of all. Starting off with a small amount of funding. What if it was 25,000? What if it was just 100,000? Like, those are still chunks of money, but you can make a difference. You can do a pilot. You can ask them, can we do a 1-year pilot? The 2017 bill was effectively just, it's a report, 20 grand. It founded the council members aren't paid. Now we get a little bit of money to, like, you know, try to go to a conference or like sponsor if we do a review day. But that's how this happened. Was there was a legislative worker who just knew the bill process, thought this was worth it, but you can identify themselves. Every single person in this room, I believe, qualifies as a knowledgeable open ed advocate. So you already have the people that can make this happen. And we award our grants through a RFP, but we can talk more about that. Oh, you have these people too. I was ahead of myself. Okay, all right.
Right, so then we move on. So the piece that I wanted to share on the back of what Chealsye is saying is I heard multiple accounts of this legislator, and I heard very different things, sort of, oh, she stepped in and saved us and it was amazing and what would we have done without her? And somebody else said, somebody was standing up and saying the most off-base, unreasonable things about OER publicly. And so we stepped in and said, can we help you? Like, and then the knowledgeable advocates formed a group. They coalesced and they helped write that bill for stroke with the legislator. So that is sort of who was an advocate, but a maybe underinformed advocate. And if we think about ROI or we think about cost savings, I know that might be wildly different in your contexts and your goals might be wildly different. And that's where this comes in, of the importance of having an ecosystem, an entire ecosystem full of things that are meaningful, full of understanding. And that's what we're all doing here, right? It's preaching to the choir here, but I'll start populating this. I've made a list of different, and I hope you can read it from where you're at, of different elements that define an OER ecosystem. And some of these might define yours and some might not. I tried to create sort of a mixture of things that are important to us in Colorado and then things that might be important over here in the UK. But it's important to have so many things, because what will matter to a legislator or to somebody who you're making an argument to, it's very important to know what stake they have in the ground, right? And think about that. And it might feel flat or one-dimensional, and all they want to talk about is cost savings, and that's the measurements that's the metrics they want to see, that's the data they want to see, that's what they can use to then, my president at my university is similar. Like, he wants compelling, individual stories, case studies and things of students and what this has made possible for them, right? But it's all down to cost savings. So I don't get to really maybe talk about all of these things, but as a knowledgeable practitioner, it's my duty to know all of these things. And so I'll ask each of you to take your second card and write down a few things, either something you see in this list or not, but perhaps the thing that drives you individually the most in OER in your own context, and then if you have time or if it's important to you, what defines your ecosystem? So maybe a few listings, a few different things that you list down. But this is key, because if you don't have the knowledgeable experts gaining wisdom, gaining practice, working in different ways and creating an ecosystem, then you can't have a movement, right? You can't sustain, you can't evolve. And so for us, one example would be open pedagogy. And so this is something we even write into our state funding, into our grants proposals and into our reports. This is a practice that we maintain at the University of Colorado on some of our campuses. Is it something I would tell our university president? No. Is it something that our legislators want to really know about? Not particularly. It's not going to help because that's not their stake, right? So it's sort of time and place. So the depth is there, the well-roundedness, the holistic piece of the movement is there, and it both helped bring this into into being. Like if that lawmaker had gone ahead without consulting advocates in the state, perhaps the funding would have come through, but the project would have fallen flat because there wasn't that depth of expertise and knowledge. And also people coming together. So that's one other piece that I gained from the interviews I did, is that it's well and good that you have people coming together, having a director, having somebody to coalesce the message, somebody not necessarily just to like an expert to coalesce the message is what I'm trying to say. Not like administering grants or administering this or organizing the conference. That's fine, but like to bring the voice together. Yep.
And so we have 3 minutes left in the session, so we can answer your questions. Somebody did bring up that they were interested in how the funding got awarded. So we were talking today, our plan was to talk about how legislation got formed and how that funded things. But just to quickly highlight, the state gives us a pot of money. And then the OER Council, we've released what's called a request for proposals every fall. There's a 60-day window. People can submit and apply. Any public institutions of higher education. They submit us up to 10 pages. We outline what is required. They submit it. We all review it. We recommend what is going to get funding, and we have to make it work with that exact dollar amount. Then a commission approves it. So that's that process. It is a very separate thing that the money's already been allocated. And then we go through a proposal form, and that's all public. We can provide links if anyone's interested to like what the RFP looked like in prior years, and there's sample grants and stuff like that. And we have annual reports we submit as well in October. So, all right, questions?
I'm interested, like, where does the OER live? Like, so how do various faculty get access to it after they've produced it?
Yeah.
Is it shared across schools? Like,
Yeah.
Is it through the LMS? Is it through a?
Great question.
Yeah.
So the majority of institutions are putting the OER, our grant program requires everything to be on a publicly accessible link. That's the majority is going through an individual institution's IR. And something that was called
stand for?
institutional repository, I think this, but yeah.
So they're all publicly accessible?
Yes, that's the point, right? They have to be. That is, that's also defined in our law, right? It's defined in our RFP. There is also something called the OER repository that I inherited, which is just a spreadsheet of all those links. As a librarian, it killed me. So we are undergoing right now, figuring out where to bring all these things together. So there is one central point to point to those individual institutional repositories, as well as likely launching a Pressbooks initiative, stuff like that, and bringing it together. So to make it more discoverable.
Course hero.
So
it's in various places, and it's been an ongoing challenge. We've talked to the state library, and so there's no clean solution for it, but it's a requirement.
That's awesome.
But it is public. It is doing what it should do, and I'm hoping to see more cross adoption of people not just creating their own OERs from our funding, but going and looking at, for example, University of Colorado Denver is currently making their entire math degree OER. I'm hoping to see our community colleges and Colorado State or different institutions across the state plug and take their OER, because that's the whole point.
And even having an aggregator for all of those different resources, and was that something that could be funded also by the money?
Yes, we have a budget within our grant that's identified as website and informational materials.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm gonna pull funding in order to do something like a Pressbooks or an OER Commons. We're figuring it out. I don't wanna have the department itself have an repository just because of the expertise that's required and not knowing because we're not a library. So any other questions in the last minute?
If you have additional questions, you could write it on that card with your name and your email address, and then I'll collect the cards and we'll hand it over to Tanya.
And if you want links to anything, you can also do that. We'll send a general email out. We'll also, of course, be around at the conference and at drinks and lunches, and would love to chat with you. And I would say we're very lucky in Colorado. I'm very thankful for the support we have and that it's such a well-supported issue across parties. But I'm also envious of other countries and other states and everything. I think we're all doing very good work to move open ed forward, just in different ways. So.
There we are.
So I just hand it over to Sam.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to be talking about considering mechanisms and implications of scale and open education. As a caveat, what I'm talking about is significantly less applied and practical than the session that we just talked about. So if you're hoping to get direct and concrete ideas on how to influence policy, you may be in the wrong place. But hopefully we will see some connections, and because I do think there are significant connections as well. So, but to start, I live in New Westminster, which is this red dot right down here near Vancouver in Canada. And I live on the unceded territory of the Kakite there with my kids. Right now I have 2 kids who live with me, but a couple weeks ago we were in Inuvik, the red dot up there, in the Northwest Territories, in the Inuvialuit settlement region. So I am a white settler. My kids though are Inuvialuit. So for them, that is home. And so we were there visiting my oldest daughter, who has been working there now for just over 1.5 years. It was a homegoing for her. And so we went up to visit. So while we were there, there's a town, to be clear. We live in houses. Nobody has doubts. But we did, but we did go out on the land while we were there, and that's a very common thing to do. So this is what it looks like. And this is the cabin that we were staying in while we were out there. And one of the first things you do when you go out to be in the land is you need water, right? First you heat up your house because that's smart. The next thing you do is you get water. So this is a picture of their Auntie Bernice. This is my oldest daughter, and this is them starting to chisel the hole. And they keep chiseling, and I think this might play a video, it may not. Oh, there we go. So that's the red chisel, and you can see the speed at which that continues forward. And then you keep chiseling. So this is about 2.5 feet down. And then you keep chiseling and keep digging out the wood. So now we're about 4 feet into the ice. That's my youngest scooping out. Where our arms are shorter than the size of the hole. And eventually the water bubbles up. And you can see, so that's the chisel down. So it's about 4 feet down in the hole. And you got to make sure you don't lose your chisel, because if you lose your chisel, tomorrow is a bad day. So that's us. And then, so from there, you scoop out the water and you put it in a bucket and you carry it 500 meters to your house. And then tomorrow when you need water, you come back out and you chisel off any ice and you do it again and again. So the question may be, what the heck does this have to do with anything? Open education, to me, this is a technology, right? This is a process and a technology. It's a technology that involves chisels and buckets and a process of getting water. Whereas when we're in town of Inuvik, we get water from the same river, but it comes through pipes and it's a pumping station, and it comes through a tap. And that's a different set of processes and technologies. But I still know where my water comes from, like it comes from the same river. And then I go back to my home in New Westminster in Vancouver, and the water still comes through the tap. But to be honest, I have no idea where that water comes from anymore. I know that it's clean because there's standards and things in place for that. But I certainly have a different relationship with my water than I do out here, right? Significantly different. And when I think about open education is about, education and open education are about learning and supports and processes. And this idea that we can use these various scales of processes to achieve education and that they look different. This is less efficient. I wouldn't recommend trying to get water to 2 million people through this process. But our relationship to the water and even the nature of the water that, even if it comes out of the same river, the water that we're drinking is a different temperature. It's been treated differently. It hasn't been tested. It's a fundamentally different process to get there. And I do believe that open education is the same.
that as we're thinking about how we get to open education, the tools that we use, the processes that we use, the relationships that we create change as we scale up or down. And it's not good or bad, but it's different, and it's important that we think about those differences. So I did a research study. So I used situational analysis, and the idea of situational analysis is really to focus on this relationality and to think about how processes work, how power relates. Processes are foregrounded, emphasizing the fluidities of power relationships. And so I was interested in the issue of scale in open education. And so what situational analysis does is it uses 3 different kinds of maps. So the first map is a relational map, and this is where you connect ideas together. And so what I had is 6 open educators. I got these words from a bunch of open educators through a survey, and then I had another group of open educators put these lines and connect things together. And then they annotated the relationships that they saw between things. And what fascinated me about this particular map is that they knew I was asking them about scale. It wasn't a surprise. And they really, really, really don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about scale. They want to talk about open pedagogy, OER, access, social justice. They want to talk about reaching audiences, going beyond the course. They want to talk about overwork. They don't want to talk about ideas of scale, right? It's something that we have a really hard time thinking about and talking about as open educators. And I think Reclaim is there somewhere, which
I see DS-106, which is
DS-106 made the list, and I feel like Reclaim made the list somewhere there, or maybe it certainly made the survey.
It was on the cutting room floor.
It's absolutely there somewhere. So that's one map, and that was open educators. When I asked them, think about open education, this is what it looks like to them. When I took those same ideas out of the initial survey and then chased them and looked like not through what the people want to talk about in the room, but all the other things, I got a very different map of open education. And this is, it's called the Social Worlds and Arena Map. Fundamentally, there's where Reclaim is, right there in the middle. There's, the field of open education, and there's all of these people who are engaged in it, and all of these folks have their own needs and wants and desires, and some of them are huge, right? We've got big tech companies, we got ed tech companies, we got foundations, we've got governments, we've got publishers, right? And they're all pushing and pulling in this space. And so this creates a really different look than the one that my open educator participants wanted to talk about. And they're both right? It's not one's right and one's wrong. It's just there are 2 very different approaches and ways of thinking about open education. The difference is this one we don't talk about very often. And all of these different groups, obviously ed tech companies can be different. Reclaim is very different than most of the others on the list. And even these ones that aren't in an ed tech space, like Bijou and VIP Kids, these are massive ed tech companies that the things that they're doing are pulling us in a direction that whether we like it or not, they're at play, and they have an impact on the work that we're doing. And not talking about it doesn't make it go away. So as to my doctoral research, I've got these 2 very different maps of open education, and my supervisor said, great, Tanya, now what? Like, what's the relationship between the 2? And I said, I have no idea. And I just spoke quick. But the good news is situational analysis has one more approach to mapping. And in that you do something called relational mapping. And with a little bit of work, what I ended up figuring out through all of that information is that really what we're talking about here is different approaches to scaling. And the one on the top, which is a production model of scale, it has to do with things getting more standardized over time. And I wish I'd had the language before, but what I took away from this morning's keynote, this is really a process of, as far as I can tell, it's like standardizing, making it simpler. It's closing doors, right? It's narrowing the hallway, narrowing the decision path. It's super efficient. That's how we get things done quick and cheap and easy. If we want to do things fast, quick, and easy, that's where we'll end up. Whether you start with little standardized things or really different things, If that's what you're chasing, that's where you'll end up. And that's, I think, part of the reason open educators don't want to talk about scale, because we recognize this path, right? This is the vast majority of what we deal with in our day-to-day lives. This is what we talk about, right? This is what people want to see. The good news, and what open educators I've found have a nuanced idea of, but not necessarily the vocabulary to talk about, is a different model, not of production, but of growth. And the difference in growth is that things can move in different ways, right? So things can get bigger without necessarily getting more uniform or being standardized. The challenge is that we don't talk about this very much, and it's unpredictable. So where here you're low risk. So again, we talked earlier this morning, the keynote talked about, minimizing risk. Again, if that's what we're doing, that's what you're going to do. If you're willing to accept risk, having things be different, it opens up a new model. But we have to think about these as trade-offs because they change. And the really key here is there's sort of this position C, which in both of them was missing. When things are small, they look the same, right? You can't necessarily, when something's, it's going to be a corporation worth billions of dollars. When it's at 2 people, it doesn't look different than something that wants to grow differently at 2 people. It's in that middle stage, and it's the middle stage that we don't talk about that changes that. Somebody had their hand up.
Yeah, this morning there was a presentation about changing the system and being disruptive.
Yeah.
But if you want to be disruptive, then you have to choose the growth model, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. You have to, if you want to be disruptive, you can be small and be disruptive and not choose a path, right? When you're tiny, doesn't matter. You get not very big, you get to sort of medium size. And if you don't choose a path, you're going to find yourself on that path. If creating a community is a priority, if that's where you sit your priority, then exactly, that disruption becomes, there's an opportunity for disruption. I think that's exactly right. So this is a bigger one, right? Just the same, right? It's a straight line. And the bigger you get, the more standardized things get. And we all have examples of that. And then this other idea, right? And the reason they're dotted lines is because there's never going to have a guarantee that it's going to move in that direction, right? You don't get a promise. It's you stick your plants in the garden and they may or may not grow. So I came up with 9 findings in 3 categories. The first ones are related to situational analysis and theory, which I'm not going to really talk about much here. If anybody's interested, let me know. The next 3, though, which I think are really interesting for this group to think about, is the one thing that I found is that open educators tend to have big intentions, tend to want to change the world, right? Doesn't matter if you want to do it, how you're going to do it, there's that desire, but we haven't thought about the how in the middle, right? We just want to change the world, but we haven't really thought about what that looks like, and that's where we lose that opportunity, I think, to really be disruptive, and our ideas get co-opted, right? I think probably everyone can think of something they've done in open education that in some way has gotten co-opted by a corporation or some other group. There's these games of scientific language. As people fund research, the more research you fund, the more likely what you want to be true turns out to be true, right? And we look at where our funding has come from, Hewlett. And to be clear, foundations, I think, so what you guys talked about, I think when this money's coming from government, I think so. It's not that money is bad, and it's not that all funding is bad. It's that we need to be thinking about where the money is coming from and the strings attached to that money.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. And then the third one that really came up is this idea of overwork among open educators. So open educators often, I think, move into these efficiency models because they're overworked, right? What am I going to do? I need to do something to make my workload less. So good news is that things can change, or that we can think about things differently. So, this is where, in terms of findings or recommendations, is that we have to talk about scale, and we have to think and clearly articulate what our intention is, right? And we need to ask other people what their intention is when they're doing these things. Accept unpredictability and uncertainty, right? Like you don't get, if you, that's part of what comes with growing, is not knowing. And then seeking to minimize educational disasters, I think, is the third. Instead of going down that narrow future, right, the future gets more and more narrow over time. The alternative is scope, is to be more flexible and have more things that make us more able to react to different futures and to imagine different futures. So, our tools and processes are relational and vary with scale. If our intentions are big, we'll seek efficiencies. And if we're looking to change in existing patterns, we need to think about what we need in scale. Like we don't go out on the land and get water this way. It's not by accident. We do it, we could buy an auger. There's other ways to get water. You don't need to use a red chisel, even if you're out on the land. Choosing to do that is part of an intentional decision made, because it changes the way that we think about things. It changes the experience of being on the land, and it's a heck of a lot of fun and exciting when the water bubbles up, right? Never been excited when the tap turned on. So thinking about those differences. So, when we think about, the theme for this conference is advancing OER. And so the questions, to where, for whom, by what means, right? And the pictures here, so we're driving in a car, or we're in a skidoo, we can walk, can travel by dog. And then my kids, because somebody suggested it, you can also skate on an ice road, which, why not, right? That's a future, that's not a traditional way of getting around, but you can, right? But you have to have the imagination to think of it, and then you can do it. So that's, I guess those are my questions to you guys as well. It's sort of to think about, not just about advancing OER, but like, where are we going and who is benefiting and what does it look like to get there? Awesome. So I think there's time for questions.
I really appreciate your visuals about, the different means of scaling. I think those were super cool. And I was sitting here kind of doodling a little bit, because I think at Reclaim we try to think really strategically about, scaling with purpose and not being overzealous, but, also being flexible enough that, we're listening to what the community needs and being able to transform as that shifts. The same thing, that technology is always changing, and so being able to shift with the times is important. And so, I think in our session tomorrow, we're going to be talking a bit more about just how we're focused on the applications themselves and how they're building in that flexibility of, being standardized to some degree and having that predictability for folks, but also providing enough sandbox space to explore and have these arms that sort of branch out and do their own thing. So anyway, just kind of a comment that's a really cool visual.
No, I think it's so important, because that's why I think the water is helpful, because it's a continuum of technologies, right?
Yeah.
It's not, I know I put them on two different maps, that's kind of the way it works, but it's a continuum of, it's not good or bad. Like I say, I don't think we want to be carrying buckets to a million people. It's not what I would advocate towards, but it's thinking about how those pieces fit together and not writing something off because it's old or inefficient or whatever.
Right.
And thinking about, when should we be using bigger infrastructures, technologies, legislation, and when should we be experimenting in sandboxes or chipping away at ice with chisels, and how do we not lose? There's a knowledge that goes with that, where you dig your water hole and everything else. And the other thing that I'll say that I think, at least in my mind, is important about the Inuvialuit settlement region and that water is that so they could have had oil and gas, right? There was an agreement to create a pipeline, and they chose not to pursue that future because the Inuvialuit decided that the ability to do this and to keep this was more important than dollars in their pockets fundamentally. Even understanding, and so they've done their bit, This is, keeping their land is more important than putting dollars in their pocket. That's a decision that they made. Even understanding that if the rest of the world melts down, they're going down with it, right? So it's not a decision. It's intentionality, a decision to create a future. Some people would argue a preposterous future, right? Something that seems like, oh, that's, you're just playing games. This stuff isn't serious. It's got to be about making money. Real people making real decisions that affected their real ways that they live in order to create a possibility of a future that creates flexibility where you can both have pumping stations and have clean water, and you can still go out on the land and chip away at it. So I think it's important to think about the nuance and the complexity, right? These aren't easy issues. So, awesome. Any other questions? Thoughts?
I see. I'm interested in this idea of that one scale you had where the idea of it wasn't, you separated it cleanly, so maybe I don't understand, but this idea of scale always leading to efficiency, and I always feel like when you start scaling to that, like, kind of over, right? The fun stuff you've done, like, you feel that with your research, like, you're seeing that, like, is that mark of scale also kind of the death of fun and enjoyment for the work you're doing in this space?
I think there's something that happens right in this sort of C to D. The missing is that there's this underlying assumption that would scale above all else. And when you do that, and that bringing people in, it's the reason you bring people in is to scale, not to have fun. Yeah. I think there's something about that. When you do that, when you stop taking the time to chip away at your water, when it gets, the most important thing is to get to the end, not to experiment or have fun anymore. I think you're right. I think you end up on a path that it's very, very, it's probably not impossible, right? Yeah. Every path can be turned off, but it gets harder and harder to turn back from that efficiency model.
Yeah, and it's interesting in relationship to the earlier talk because you can't scale OER for a state. I mean, you can't really do OER in that context for a state unless you scale it. So you have to deal with that.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting challenge.
It's an interesting challenge, but I think what I heard is intentionality.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't do this haphazard. They didn't take the first venture capitalist who came along and offered money to do it, right? There's thought gone into it. And I think that's where the healthy tension comes in.
When you began and you were talking about chipping away the ice, I was like, okay, I get the metaphor. And I was actually wrong technically about like the point of it, because then you expanded. But I was like, that's what advocating for open feels like. Like it wasn't right, like Sisyphean, right? You're rolling it up, but you were chipping away. And you're going, but then the bubbles come, right? And how much joy, and that is worth all the effort. And it is so pure and beautiful, and you have a relationship with the person when it works. And I don't get to do that anymore, right? I'm far away, but people who manage grants, they do have a closer relationship. It is actually possible to maintain some of it because it's not like one system in charge of it. The people we give money to. Those people then do have relationships with their individual faculty. I'm far away from it, but that fun still happen. Fun can still happen.
And I think it depends on the model. So if we chipped away that hole and the whole reason was to build a factory to bottle water, that's a different model, right?
Totally.
And I think we can think of open educational examples where we started chipping knowing that the end goal is to make billions of dollars off the water. That's not what you guys are talking about. And so I think that, you guys may just be chipping lots of holes, which is also cool. I think
that's actually, I think it's actually probably what's happening, but when you're talking about saying more inclusive access-y kind of versions of OER, it's different than what your goals are, and we make choices.
They're all choices and being intentional about those choices versus thinking just it's all going to be revolutionary and then saying, oh shoot, our work has been co-opted. I think that's a pattern that we've seen.
And the importance of the political savvy of the face you have to wear to get some of that is like important, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm wondering in the next model of growth, position E,
operation.
Yes, because there's always a tension for me between scaling up or growing and what is defined as success. Because as something grows up involves many voices of others, and how can we? And I would like to hear you more because it's related on the questions like for whom and how and where. When it's
Yeah.
growing, how do we manage to maybe accept many definitions of success, and how can this be positioned? Can we have many successes?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly, if you're gonna use a growth model,
Yeah.
you're not gonna, you're doing the opposite of controlling it, which means it's gonna turn into a whole bunch of different things. Some of which you might like, some of which might really take off, some might not grow, and there, you might get some weeds, right? And so then you gotta think about what you do with those weeds as well. Do you let them grow? Because if you let the weeds grow, you're gonna end up with a weedy garden, right? So now I'm mixing my metaphors, but, yeah, but I think that's exactly it. It's that idea that it can go in all different directions, and there's gonna be many different definitions of success.
Perfect, awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah. So you've got 6 minutes to get from here to your next